1993. Luanda, Angola. A bag of rice costs 1.5 million kwanzas. 6 months earlier it cost 50,000. The currency has lost 97% of its value in under a year, and it is still falling. Angola is sitting on top of some of the richest oil deposits in sub-Saharan Africa and one of the largest diamond reserves on Earth. The country generates billions of dollars in export revenue every year, and its people are starving. Children in the capital are eating grass. The central bank is printing money faster than the presses can run, and 2 armies, each funded by a different superpower, each sitting on top of the same natural wealth, are burning the country from the inside out, not because they want to destroy it but because destroying it is, for both of them, the optimal strategy. How does a country with more natural wealth than most of Europe end up with one of the worst economic collapses in modern history? And why does the pattern of war-funded resource extraction that ran Angola for 27 years keep appearing in a dozen countries right now, in exactly the same form, producing exactly the same outcomes? This is the story of Angola's economic war. By the end you will understand how natural resources stop being a country's salvation and become its curse. See the financial architecture that lets outside powers profit from a civil war they never have to fight in, and recognize the warning signs of a resource trap while it is still forming. That it is the mid-1970s. Luanda, Angola, and the city smells like ocean and diesel and the particular anxiety of a place that knows everything is about to change but cannot see clearly in which direction. The Portuguese are leaving. After 500 years of colonial rule and a brutal 13-year independence war, Portugal's government collapses in Lisbon in April 1974 in what becomes known as the Carnation Revolution, and one of the first things the new government does is begin dismantling the empire. In Angola, that process is not peaceful. 3 separate liberation movements, the MPLA, the FNLA, and UNITA, have been fighting the Portuguese and each other for years, and now the prize they have all been fighting for is suddenly available. Independence is coming. The question is who will control what comes after it. The economy that the Portuguese leave behind is a peculiar thing. Angola is, on paper, potentially one of the wealthiest countries in Africa. It has oil fields off the Cabinda coast that American companies have been pumping since the 1960s. It has diamond deposits in the northeast, in the Lunda provinces, that rank among the most productive alluvial diamond fields in the world. It has fertile agricultural land in the Central Highlands that, under colonial production, fed not just Angola but exported food across the continent, coffee, cotton, seeds, and it has a port at Luanda that sits at the geographic center of the southern Atlantic trade routes. This is a country that, under different political circumstances, might have become wealthy. The political circumstances are not different, they are the worst possible version of what they could be. By the time the Portuguese formally leave in November 1975, Angola is already a proxy battlefield for the Cold War. The Soviet Union and Cuba are backing the MPLA, which controls Luanda and the oil fields. The United States and apartheid South Africa are backing UNITA and the FNLA. Neither superpower cares particularly about Angolan sovereignty or Angolan prosperity. They care about Angola's strategic position and Angola's resources, and they are willing to fund an unlimited amount of Angolan death to secure their preferred outcome. The MPLA wins the initial contest for Luanda, declares independence, and becomes the recognized government. UNITA retreats to the bush. The war, rather than ending, simply changes form. It will continue for 27 more years. Meet Jonas Savimbi. He is UNITA's founder and absolute leader, a tall, physically imposing man with a PhD in political science from the University of Lausanne and a gift for self-presentation that borders on genius. He speaks English, French, Portuguese, and 4 Angolan languages. He gives speeches that make Western journalists describe him as charismatic, a statesman, a freedom fighter. Ronald Reagan calls him one of the authentic heroes of the 20th century and receives him at the White House. Savimbi tells every foreign audience exactly what it wants to hear. To Americans, he is fighting communism. To black African leaders, he is fighting imperialism. To the diamond merchants in Antwerp, he is a reliable business partner. What he actually is, underneath all of it, is a man who has built a military organization that can sustain itself indefinitely by controlling diamond fields and selling the stones through networks that ask no questions. He does not need to win the war. He needs to keep it going. The war is the business model, but Lopo do Nascimento sees something different. He is the MPLA's first prime minister, a bureaucrat rather than a soldier. And in 1975 he is trying to hold together a government that has no functioning civil service, no trained administrative corps, and almost no educated population because the Portuguese, in 180 years of colonial rule, had given less than 2% of Angolans access to secondary education. He inherits institutions that exist on paper and almost nowhere else. The central bank has no staff who understands central banking. The tax authority cannot collect taxes in a country where the road network is already being destroyed by war. The oil revenue flows in, and it flows directly into the war budget. Because the alternative is losing, and losing means Savimbi. Do Nascimento is not corrupt in the way that history eventually describes the MPLA. He is desperate, and desperation and corruption produce similar policy outcomes. And then there is José Eduardo dos Santos, who becomes president in 1979 and will hold that position for 38 years. He is a quiet, methodical man with an engineering degree from a Soviet university and an instinct for political survival that keeps him in power through multiple peace agreements, multiple resumptions of war, and a global oil boom and bust. And he solves the fundamental problem of the MPLA's legitimacy by making the oil revenues flow to a sufficiently large network of beneficiaries that removing him becomes more dangerous than keeping him. He does not build Angola. He builds the system that makes Angola's resources extractable without the extraction benefiting Angola's people. It is, in its way, a sophisticated political achievement. What none of them know yet is that the war will go on for 27 years and kill 500,000 people and leave a country with oil revenues measured in the tens of billions sitting on top of a population living on less than $2 a day. The mechanism that turns Angola's resource wealth into a curse rather than a salvation begins with the structure of the oil deal. The MPLA government, desperate for revenue and without the administrative capacity to manage an oil sector directly, grants exploration and production rights to foreign companies, most prominently Chevron and later BP, Total Energies and others, in exchange for a share of the production. The deal looks straightforward on paper. Angola gets royalties and taxes, the companies get oil, but the structure of the deal, the way revenue flows, is built around a state oil company called Sonangol, and Sonangol becomes, over time, not just an oil company but a parallel government. It pays for military equipment, it funds infrastructure projects, selectively, in ways that serve the military campaign. It maintains the loyalty of regime insiders through employment and contracts. The oil revenue never passes through a budget that any parliament approves or any auditor can fully examine. It flows into Sonangol and then out through a network of contracts and disbursements that is deliberately opaque. By the early 1980s, Angola is producing roughly 150,000 barrels of oil per day. By the late 1980s, that number is approaching 500,000. The money is enormous by any measure of a country with Angola's population and infrastructure, but none of it reaches the local economy in any way that builds productive capacity. Roads are not built, hospitals are not staffed, schools are not supplied. The oil sector is, in the most literal sense, an enclave. The wells are offshore. The workers who operate them are largely expatriates living in secured compounds. The revenue goes from the oil companies to Sonangol, to the government's war budget and the personal accounts of government insiders. The rest of the economy, the agriculture and small business and local trade that most Angolans depend on, is starved of everything it needs while sitting on top of one of the continent's richest resource bases. UNITA mirrors this structure on the diamond side. By 1992, Savimbi controls the Kwango Valley and large sections of the Lunda provinces, which produce some of the world's finest gem-quality diamonds. The stones come out of the ground through a combination of forced labor and artisanal diggers who are paid almost nothing, and they move through networks of Lebanese traders and Belgian brokers into Antwerp's diamond market, where they are sold as any other rough stones because the Kimberley process, the international certification system designed to prevent exactly this, does not yet exist. De Beers, the South African diamond monopoly, buys conflict diamonds through intermediaries for years because the alternative is allowing competitors to accumulate rough supply that would undercut De Beers's pricing control. Savimbi earns an estimated $3 to $4 billion in diamond revenue between 1992 and 2002. That money buys weapons, pays soldiers, and sustains a war that kills hundreds of thousands of people and displaces 4 million more. The peace agreement of May 1991, the BICES Accords, lasts exactly 17 months. An election in September 1992 produces a result that the United Nations certifies as free and fair. with the MPLA winning the first round and Savimbi refusing to accept the results. What follows is the worst concentrated period of violence in the entire war. In 2 weeks of fighting in Luanda and other cities in late October and November 1992, between 10,000 and 30,000 people are killed. The exact number is not known because nobody was counting carefully. International observers who had certified the election are evacuated. The war resumes with the diamond revenues financing it at a scale that makes the previous phase look restrained. UNITA captures more territory in 1993 than in any previous year. The government's oil revenue allows it to buy weapons from any willing seller, including from the former Soviet bloc countries flooding the market with cheap arms. Both sides are well. Neither side can win decisively because the resource base sustaining each is not the population it claims to represent. It is the ground beneath that population's feet. The inflation that obliterates the Kwanzaa through 1993 and 1994 is the most visible economic symptom of the broader destruction, but it is not the disease. It is the fever. The disease is the complete disconnection between Angola's paper wealth and its people's material condition. The government, unable to tax a functioning economy because there is almost no functioning economy to tax, funds its war expenditure by printing money. The central bank's printing presses run continuously. By the end of 1994, Angola's annual inflation rate reaches 1,354%. Wages paid on a Monday are worth 30% less by Friday. Anyone holding Kwanzaas is watching their savings dissolve in real time. The population shifts almost entirely to dollar transactions for any significant purchase. Not because the dollar is legally required, but because the Kwanzaa is functionally worthless for storing value. This is not hyperinflation in the technical sense of 50% per month. It is something perhaps worse in human terms, a slow-motion destruction of the monetary system that leaves people poor, not through a single shock but through relentless daily erosion. Year after year, Maria, a schoolteacher in Wal, earns 30,000 kwanzas a month in 1992, which at the exchange rate of the time is roughly $100. By late 1993, the same salary buys $11. She has not received a pay raise, and the government has not cut her nominal salary. The currency has simply dissolved around her. She sells her furniture to buy food. Her school has no books and no chalk, because the government procurement system has broken down and the budget allocations for education, when they exist at all, are paid in kwanzas that are worth less each week than they were when they were allocated. She teaches anyway, because leaving her students would feel like abandonment, and because she has nowhere else to go. Carlos, a general in the FAA, the government army, operates on a very different economic plane. His salary is modest by any formal measure. His actual income flows from contracts, from the licensing of unofficial diamond mining operations in government-controlled areas, from a share of fuel and supplies diverted from military logistics chains. He is not exceptional. He is typical of a military leadership class that has learned to extract wealth from the war economy because the formal economy offers nothing comparable. He is not going to negotiate peace. Peace would end the arrangement that sustains him. He will negotiate ceasefire agreements and wait for them to collapse, and then negotiate the next one. And in between he will manage his portfolio. Otter is a Luanda, a businessman who trades in exactly the products that a war economy needs: fuel, vehicles, spare parts, pharmaceuticals, communications, equipment. He holds dollars. He bought a warehouse in 1994, $80,000. By 1995 it is worth $1.2 million in real terms. Not because the warehouse has improved, but because every piece of commercial real estate in Luanda is appreciating as the city fills with military contractors, oil company employees, NGO workers, and the security apparatus that protects all of them. He is not a war profiteer in any legal sense. He is a man who positioned himself correctly in a market that the war has created. The war is good for Arta. Arta knows this. Arta is not going to advocate for peace. By 1997, the human cost has accumulated beyond any number that conveys its full weight. 4 million Angolans are internally displaced, 1/3 of the entire population. Life expectancy at birth is 42 years. 1 in 4 children dies before the age of 5. Angola has the highest amputee rate in the world, from landmines that both armies have seeded across the countryside in densities that will take decades to clear. The agricultural sector, which once fed the country and generated export income, has collapsed. Farmers who left their land to escape fighting cannot return because the mines are everywhere, and the seeds and tools they need to restart are unavailable. Angola, which exported food in the 1960s, imports 80% of its food supply in 1997, paid for with oil revenue that the government desperately needs for other purposes. This is the full weight of what the war has produced, and still the war continues. February 22, 2002, Jonas Savimbi is killed in a firefight with government forces in the Moxico province, in the eastern bush where he has been hiding for months. He is 67 years old. He has been at war for nearly 40 years. He had lost most of his international support after the Cold War ended and the diamond certification processes began, making the financing harder, and the Angolan army, better equipped after years of oil revenue purchasing, had been hunting him methodically. His death ends the war within weeks. A ceasefire is signed on April 4, 2002. There is no political settlement, no power-sharing arrangement, no reconciliation process. UNITA simply ceases to function as a military force without its leader. The war ends not because peace was chosen but because the instrument of war died. And still, nobody asks the real question. So what does the conventional story say about Angola? It says a newly independent country was caught between Cold War powers and destroyed by their proxy competition. That when the Cold War ended and international support faded, the war wound down, and that Angola's oil wealth has since allowed it to rebuild. That story describes some of what happened. It skips almost entirely over the economic architecture that made the war sustainable for 27 years. And the reason that architecture matters is that it is still operating, in Angola and elsewhere, with different actors and different resources, but the same structural logic. What actually happened is that Angola had two parallel economies, running simultaneously throughout the war. The first was the legitimate economy, the one that appeared in government statistics and international reports, where oil revenue flowed to the government and diamond revenue was reported to reach UNITA's administration of its controlled territories. The second economy ran underneath the first, through a network of offshore accounts, shadow companies, arms dealers, commodity traders, and Western financial institutions that processed transactions without asking whether the source of the funds was a government fighting a civil war or a rebel movement funding its continuation with forced labor diamonds. The war was not funded by the Angolan economy. It was funded by external actors who wanted Angola's resources and were willing to process the financial transactions required to access them, regardless of what those transactions financed. The arms dealer Victor Bout, a Russian national later convicted in the United States for conspiracy to kill Americans, ran a network of cargo airlines throughout the 1990s that supplied weapons to both sides of the Angolan War. Along with conflicts across Africa and Southeast Asia, he was not exceptional. He was one node in a supply network that operated openly, documented in reports that named him and his operations years before any government acted on the information. The diamond brokers in Antwerp who bought UNITA stones were not criminal enterprises by Belgian law. They were licensed traders operating in a market that had no certification requirements. The oil companies paying Sonangil's royalties were operating within their legal obligations. Every link in the chain was, in its own jurisdiction, largely legal. The aggregate result was a war machine that ran for 27 years and killed 500,000 people. Now look at the pattern across the cases. The new paradigm is the belief, held in good faith by the resource companies and the financial institutions that serve them, that commercial extraction of natural resources is politically neutral, that paying a government royalties for oil does not amount to funding the political structure of that government, that the distinction between a government and a kleptocracy is somebody else's problem to adjudicate. The easy money is the oil and diamond revenue itself, which flows regardless of what the government does to its people because the resource is in the ground, and the companies can access it through contract. The social proof is the roster of major Western companies doing business in Angola: Chevron, BP, Total Energies, each one's presence making the next company's decision to stay less controversial. The complexity is the corporate structure of Sonangol and the network of subsidiaries and offshore vehicles through which Angola's oil revenue moved, a structure complex enough that no outside auditor could fully trace where the money went. The peak euphoria is the post-war oil boom of the 2000s, when Angola's GDP grew at 15% a year for 6 straight years, and the government announced that Angola was on track to become a middle-income country, while 70% of the population continued to live on less than $2 a day. The trigger is not a market crash but the 2014 oil price collapse. which cuts Angola's government revenue by 60% and reveals how completely the economy has been structured around oil rather than anything that survives a price drop. And the blame game runs through the corruption investigations that begin after Dos Santos leaves power in 2017, in which his daughter Isabel, who ran Sonangol for 2 years, is accused of extracting over $2 billion in fraudulent contracts. And the case wins through international courts while the assets in question move through a jurisdictional maze designed to resist exactly this kind of pursuit. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Now look at 2025. Because Angola's story is not a historical anomaly. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces 70% of the world's cobalt, a mineral that is now essential for every electric vehicle battery manufactured anywhere on Earth. The cobalt comes primarily from artisanal mines in the Katanga province, where children as young as 6 dig with hand tools in conditions that human rights organizations have documented at length, and technology companies have acknowledged in their supply chain audits and have largely continued sourcing from anyway, because the alternative is paying more for a mineral that has no certified conflict-free supply chain at scale. The DRC government collects royalties that flow through a state mining company, Jeka Mines, whose finances are not publicly audited in any meaningful sense. Armed groups control portions of the mining territory and tax the production directly. Major technology companies, including Apple, Tesla, and Samsung, have been named in lawsuits by families of children killed or injured in cobalt mines. The cases are pending. The cobalt is still moving. Run through the checklist. New paradigm. The current version is the belief that the green energy transition is urgent enough to justify accepting supply chain risks that would be unacceptable for other commodities. That the long-term environmental benefit of electric vehicles outweighs the immediate human cost of how their critical minerals are extracted. Easy money. The global demand for cobalt is projected to triple by 2030, and the price pressure of that demand makes the DRC's supply, whatever its conditions, close to irreplaceable in the short term. Social proof. Every major automaker and technology company sources cobalt from the DRC. No single company faces a competitive disadvantage from doing so because all of them are doing it. Complexity. The cobalt supply chain passes through enough intermediaries between the Katangan mine and the finished battery cell that any single company can credibly claim insufficient visibility into upstream conditions, and that claim is accepted by investors and regulators without serious challenge. Peak euphoria. In 2022, analysts describe the DRC as potentially the Saudi Arabia of the energy transition, a framing that captures how completely the resource curse logic has been imported into the green economy conversation, without any apparent awareness of what happened to Saudi Arabia's neighbors when they sat on top of a resource the world needed. What is genuinely different now? The Kimberley process, whatever its limitations, did establish the principle that commodity markets can be required to distinguish between conflict-sourced and legitimately sourced supply, and that principle has expanded in European supply chain due diligence legislation that comes into full force in 2024. The Dodd-Frank Act's conflict, minerals, provision, covering tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold from Central Africa, created disclosure requirements that have produced some supply chain transparency even if they have not ended the problem. These are not trivial developments. They represent an architecture of accountability that did not exist during Angola's war. They are also, in the view of most independent experts who study these supply chains, far insufficient for the scale of the problem. Watch for any situation where a critical mineral has a highly concentrated supply geography, controlled by a government with limited accountability and a domestic population that does not share in the export revenues. Watch for supply chain audits that rely on self-reporting by the companies being audited rather than independent verification. And watch for the moment when a resource that the world needs urgently is framed as too important to subject to the supply chain standards applied to less strategically critical commodities. That framing is how Angola's oil got processed through Western financial systems for 27 years of civil war. It is how it happens every time, so why do we keep building these arrangements? Why does every generation of policymakers and corporate leaders look at the documented history of resource extraction in conflict zones and decide that the current situation is different enough to proceed on substantially the same terms? The answer is not cynicism, though cynicism is present. The answer is a disaggregation problem. The decision to buy cobalt from a DRC supplier is made by a procurement officer trying to hit a cost target, The decision to process the payment is made by a compliance officer reviewing a sanctioned parties list. The decision to approve the supply chain audit methodology is made by a sustainability officer choosing between bad options. No individual in this chain is making a decision to fund child labor or armed group taxation of mines. Each individual is making a locally rational decision within the constraints of their role. The aggregate result is a system that funds exactly those things. At scale, continuously. This is the mechanism Angola demonstrated across 27 years. Not that evil people made evil decisions, though some did. That ordinary people with ordinary incentives, operating in systems designed to make their individual decisions seem reasonable, collectively produced outcomes that no individual would have endorsed if asked to approve the whole chain at once. The war ran because arms dealers needed business and found it, because diamond brokers needed supply and found it, because oil companies needed access and found it, because banks needed transactions and processed them. Nobody voted for the war. The war was the emergent product of 1,000 individually defensible decisions. You cannot change Angola's past, but the architecture that funded Angola's war is still standing, modified and in some places constrained, but structurally present in every resource economy where governance is weak and external demand is strong. The question of whether the green energy transition will repeat the resource curse in a new set of countries is not settled. It is actively being determined right now, by procurement decisions and legislative choices and investment standards that are being made while most of the people who will live with the consequences are not in the room. History does not require your participation to rhyme, but the rhyme is louder when the people who know the pattern stay silent. Now I want to hear what you think. Which critical mineral supply chain do you believe is most likely to reproduce the Angola pattern over the next decade? And what would a supply chain standard actually need to look like to change the incentive structure rather than just document it? Drop that in the comments. If this changed how you think about where the minerals in your phone came from, hit the like button and subscribe. Next time, we are going inside the story of how a single small country in Southeast Asia became the test case for every development theory of the 20th century, and what the results actually showed. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming loud. See you in the next one.